Hey everyone, back again. All right, let us continue with our episode 3 of Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's Manufacturing Consent. Now we're going to cover from chapter 5 to the end. That is going to cover the Indochina Wars. We're going to start with Vietnam, then go into Laos and Cambodia. But before jumping into it, you know the drill, all the things. Go check out parts 1 and 2 before listening to this one, because what are you doing? Follow me on things, contribute to one of the organizations listed below. It would really mean a lot to me. And yeah, remember when this is for the deep cut for the people who, actually listen to part 3s of the things that I do. Remember when I used to have intro music? Should I do that again? I'm like, why? Do I need to do like the long, you gotta have a stylized introduction? That's probably how the proper people do this stuff. I don't know. I just like, whatever. Just jump into it. It's about the ideas, right? That's all you need. Now, the Vietnam War period, to jump right into it, the Vietnam War period is often heralded as a triumph of the mainstream media within the United States because they ostensibly depicted the United States in a bad light. When Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman are going to really try and disabuse us of that idea, where they're like, no, pretty much how the mainstream media framed it was like how this was a horrible tragedy for America and Americans, and how it was like a mistake, and how it was a failure on the part of the U.S. military. So it's not like the mainstream media was coming out and saying that this is just another example of American imperialism, and that's why it was wrong. They're saying it was wrong because of the exceptionally high casualty rate of Americans that they were sending. And they didn't care about the hundreds of thousands of murdered Vietnamese, murdered Cambodians. It's just absolutely horrendous. So we can look at this, and as it is often celebrated, it's celebrated as this period of true journalistic independence, when it was really just another example of media capitulating, submitting to the 5 filters and the propaganda model. Now, there's no denying, though, that the media held somewhat of an ambiguous role during the U.S.'s invasion of Vietnam. Now, they obviously, they were parroting U.S. talking points, especially at first, but then as the casualty rate of Americans went up, they started to become more critical. But this, again, we have to be very clear. This criticism was... It was mostly at the horror, and it was at the absolute, the violence that was being done against the aggressors. As people in Vietnam on the National Liberation Front were fighting against the Americans, it was killing a lot of Americans. And so this is what got the mainstream media all riled up and got them to start pressuring the U.S. government. Now, one of the things that happened is that, there were many people in the American public that saw a lot of the footage, and they weren't saying that, they weren't thinking like, oh, poor Americans. They were seeing it, and they were saying like, this is horrible what we're doing to the Vietnamese. Like, this is absolutely horrendous. And that is good. And that was a byproduct. It was an unintended consequence of the U.S.'s showing footage on television screens in people's homes of the horrors going on there, of U.S. violence against the Vietnamese, that the news media wasn't totally aware of what they were doing because they were trying to frame it as like, look at how the U.S. is doing its war effort. And suddenly people were seeing this with their eyeballs and thinking, wow, this can't be right. Like, there's no way we can permit this. Like, that's not good. Now, in response, many people, and this is when a lot of what are now current ideas about media censorship emerged, was during Vietnam, was a lot of people were really upset by this because there were groups that were opposed to seeing violent images, which was one approach. Another approach was that there were groups that were like, maybe we don't really want all of these images to be coming out, which, I don't know. Maybe this is part of the reason that the US and Canada and other Western states are really opposed to TikTok, in that it's on TikTok that you can find a lot of the images and videos of Israeli aggression in Gaza and the West Bank. Now, let's not be naive. I mean, this is something that I think some other media scholars are really right about, in that the images aren't enough, because people can still see those images and they scroll through the next video, and then it's like puppies or something, and they totally forgot what they were just looking at. It's almost like, the TikTok thing is a way by which to help normalize this kind of violence, where it just kind of, if you were to look at your TikTok reels, like all the videos you see on TikTok, imagine instead of you scrolling through them, you had them out on like a long strip of tape, and you can see what each video is one after the other. And you could see it's like whatever dog video, cooking video, horrible violence in Gaza, turtle trying to speak to someone, a kid falling off their bike, whatever, some innocuous stuff. And it is that very structure that permits a certain kind of desensitization, in that like your emotional like disposition towards it it's not meant to sustain itself. Like, you're supposed to go on to the next video and then completely change your emotional state. So without this just devolving into an anti-social media thing, which by the end of this, I hope you don't think that I think that. I think there is something to be said about the way that just seeing images of violence isn't enough to like encourage people to be active. There needs to be more behind this. But in any case, at this time, this was for many people the first times they were seeing American violence with their eyeballs. And they were like, wow, this is horrendous. Which also is like, how much violence that, is the public just not aware of? That we've never seen, that was occurring, 100 years ago, that we just don't know about. And in response, during Vietnam, there was a huge anti-war movement, really one of the biggest. I think that maybe now the pro-Palestinian movement has exceeded it. I don't know. That probably would have been smart for me to look up. But there were these huge anti-war movements all throughout the United States, which the U.S. would reluctantly, the mainstream media would reluctantly cover. They would actually present footage of this. Would they invite, like, someone standing for the anti-war movement? Would they invite them on and, like, give them a platform? No. Just like the same with the Palestine stuff. Like, you'll see news outlets inviting on, like, a friendly kind of pro-Palestinian person, or one that's, like, super incendiary and is going to just say something that's, like, it's just meant to, like, demean the whole movement or something. Like, that's very strategically done in those ways. And they do that in order to carefully limit what is going to be heard about this movement, about the project. So even as it was clear that the U.S. was going to lose the war in the early to mid 70s, the mainstream media would only really go so far as to label it a mistake or a failure, not as being morally reprehensible and that U.S. officials should be held accountable for what they approved of. No, they wouldn't go that far, of course not. They would just call it like a mistake. Now, of course, the mainstream media reserved only such inflammatory rhetoric for the Soviets, right? Anything evil that they can attribute to the Soviets or to the communists in Vietnam, then they would do that. Then that was no problem. Then they were very willing to attribute blame, very willing to call for people to be arrested, and so on. Now, one of the other tactics that they employed was the consistent use of the term Viet Cong to refer to the National Liberation Front, which was a real organization in Vietnam. But by calling it the Viet Cong, they were able to lend it a certain amount of illegitimacy, like framing them as this unorganized, asynchronous guerrilla group instead of an actually established political organization that was fighting against American violence and involvement there, and that has had a history in fighting against French occupation of Vietnamese territory, of Vietnam, which is part of the backstory. Like, it was colonized by the French, and how these organizations had fought the French before then, and how in the early 50s, 1950s, early to mid 50s, about a decade before the U.S. officially, quote unquote, went to war with Vietnam, they instilled their own death squad inspired government in Vietnam, like they had done in El Salvador and Guatemala. And of course, you will find little mention in the mainstream media of the way in which in the early 60s, the Kennedy administration greenlit the indiscriminate bombing of South Vietnamese villages to push rural Vietnamese into concentration camps where they would be safe. And this would be a common tactic that would be deployed all throughout Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, just bombing, because they wanted to limit the pool of possible recruits to the National Liberation Front in Vietnam. And to do so, they had to displace people and put them in these concentration camps where they could be, controlled, so that they wouldn't be in these rural places being recruited by the National Liberation Front, what the mainstream media insisted on always calling the Viet Cong. And like these are the horrors that the U.S. inflicted, like just indiscriminate bombing. I have a friend whose father's best friend was murdered as a child, and he had to carry his friend's corpse back to their village after being murdered by Americans. Like it's horrendous. Like, and this is like a real, for me to even say that, like, of course it's real. It is just such an overwhelming trauma still within Vietnam. Like, these are people still alive who experienced these horrors and not knowing if they were going to die any given day because of U.S. bombing. Now, the quote-unquote war kicked off in 1964, 1965, after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now, the Gulf of Tonkin incident is a perfect demonstration of American, it's mirrored among Israelis, this victimhood complex. Now, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, what had happened there was the U.S. thought that they were fired upon. Turns out they weren't. Fired upon by some Vietnamese, fisher folk or something, was fired at one of their huge ships that was just parked up right in the Gulf of Tonkin, right up against Vietnam, which didn't happen. But then the U.S. used this to murder many people there and to justify invading Vietnam. Now, before the war, quote-unquote war, kicked off in 1965, before then, upwards of 100,000 people had already been murdered by the U.S. with napalm. Not just the U.S. directly, but their client regimes and their client regimes as murder groups, like even China. China was pretty important for the U.S. here, but Korean mercenary groups that were established in Vietnam that were essentially these death squads, making sure that American interest was really being satisfied there, which is like absolutely horrible. So, and this is all context that is just completely ignored, like the history of Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territory before October 7th. Like, all of this is just ignored, and then it's treated as like, oh, the war started in 65. When it's like, no, what are you talking about? That's a wacky thing to say. I thought we liked facts here. I thought we were all rational fact lovers. And this isn't even to consider yet the indiscriminate bombing of people in Laos and Cambodia, because the U.S. was very scared of the way in which Laos and Cambodia had, they were kind of sympathizing with Vietnam and was sending them troops and was willing to participate with them. And so the U.S. could not tolerate this, especially in the case of Ho Chi Minh, where the Ho Chi Minh Trail was very important and it connected into Laos, where in the late 50s, I'm going to get a little scant on the details here. In the late 50s, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was largely used for what is framed as the North Vietnamese invasion of Laos, but it was really in an effort to liberate them from American imperialism, framed as an invasion. Of course, that gets framed as an invasion. And the Ho Chi Minh Trail would then be instrumental later on for supplies being sent the other way from Laos into Vietnam. And so the U.S. was like, of course, we have to bomb Laos into oblivion and murder countless rural peasants who are just, trying to live on their farms and live their lives, like just being bombed indiscriminately. Now, by the end of the quote-unquote war, about a decade later, upwards of 4 million people were killed by the U.S. 4 million. Like, it's so horrendous. Now, despite all this, it would be nearly impossible to find a source in the mainstream media condemning the U.S. regime, to condemn its allies, and the violences it inflicted against people in Southeast Asia here. Now, the mainstream media just framed it as a battle between democracy and communism. And of course, there was little to no mention of the U.S. stifling free elections the decade before in the 60s. And they just amplified this myth of communist terror. But of course, this is how the story goes, right? This is how it's often framed. that the North Vietnamese they just took on, because of Soviet influence, they took on the communist bug and then started to invade South Vietnam. But there's a problem here. And the problem, kind of baked into one of the things I mentioned earlier, is that the US was bombing South Vietnam for years before the North Vietnamese invasion. And that's because the North Vietnamese, as had a more established group, were like, these people are being murdered. Like, we need to be involved here. We need to be, actually stopping this with the help of the Soviets. And is this to say that the North Vietnamese didn't commit any violence? No, that would be absolutely ridiculous to say. The violence in no way compared to that inspired by the US. It's like in the same of Nicaragua. Like, is it a perfect place? No. But does it deserve any criticism compared to US violence? Like, no. Like, how about we do it proportionally to the amount of violence? And then that'll determine how much news coverage these different states get and how much condemnation they receive. Wouldn't that be the rational approach to doing this? I'd be all for it. We should then criticize the NLF, National Liberation Front, the Northern Vietnamese, the Communists, the Soviets, that reflects the actual violence and the actual atrocities that they've committed. And most of this is only what people have been made aware of after the fact and decades later. And there would be many people after the Vietnam invasion, that many U.S. military people who'd come out and they told their stories about like the horrible stuff that they were ordered to do. Like the people they were just told, like the villages they were just told to quote unquote light up and just like murder people in villages. And it was part of their goal. Now the bombings was part of it, same with the napalm and the Agent Orange. Part of the thing was that they wanted to collectively punish the Vietnamese. And one way to do that is to make sure that the land is uninhabitable. Very much seems to be the same strategy with Israel in Gaza. It's not about the hostages, it never has been. It's about punishing these people and rendering the land inhospitable unless you have enough resources to actually rebuild it, which Palestinians do not possess. So then what's going to happen? Only time will tell, but we have a pretty good idea. But it's part of the strategy to collectively punish these people and to make it impossible for them to do anything other than to submit to U.S. authority, which of course they didn't do in Vietnam, and Palestinians and Hamas won't do, I think. I don't know, but I think. Now, like many of these news outlets, NBC, ABC, CBS, they were responsible for concealing some of these atrocities because they actually ordered many of their broadcasters to refrain from depicting images of Vietnamese and American soldiers. So to avoid depicting them committing violence and avoid seeing violence committed against them. Now this changed in really 1968 with the Tet Offensive. So the Tet Offensive was a surprise attack orchestrated by the NLF against Americans in densely populated areas, but also against a lot of American military installations. Now, the Tet Offensive was an extremely effective military maneuver, even though it resulted in many Vietnamese casualties, like North Vietnamese military people. There are many casualties on their side. It was overall a grand success for the Vietnamese because it expanded their recruitment massively, because it really put on display like how easily the US could be defeated and how ill-equipped the US was to actually fight. And it emboldened many people in Vietnam to actually recognize that if they did fight, they could win. And at this moment, the Vietnamese, when they attacked these populated areas, attacking the Americans, they attacked places where broadcasters were. And so broadcasters and news people could not ignore what had happened during the Tet Offensive, and they had to report on it. And this was a turning point when people in the US saw just Vietnam for what a horror show it was. Mostly they were worried about their American comrades being sent overseas to fight in this BS war. But like still, it motivated this anger and it got people aware of all of the bloodshed. But the mainstream media was still make sure to frame every single NLF soldier as like fanatical monsters. Same with Hamas, as fanatical monsters, and every single American as this like poor young man from Albuquerque or whatever, not deserving of this, just this poor guy. And we would see this played out in film as well. Films like The Deer Hunter that depict like what happened to the poor Americans in Vietnam, or I think it's Coming Home, or like the horrors of war and like how brutal it is for people, like these poor Americans. Absolutely horrendous stuff. So horrendous. Full Metal Jacket, like, oh, how hard it was for the Americans and all the brutal training they had to go through, and then the violence they inflicted. It was so hard on them. Like, all of these films, like the mainstream media, satisfy these ideological interests that make the war seem palatable, not necessarily in itself, but the very idea of American imperialism still seem palatable, while being like, oh, it's the war that's the problem. So instead, and this is the strategy that they would adopt during the Gulf War, this is what Baudrillard writes about. One of the things he writes about is that the U.S. turned it into what they called a clean war. So they're like, we're having this problem dealing with this public that cares about human suffering. How about we just murder people with scientific precision with drone strikes to limit how they'll be seen, if they'll be seen at all, because there won't be any journalists there, and there won't be any American casualties because they'll be 400 miles away controlling a joystick, bombing kids in their homes in Iraq. That is now being done against Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. And so they're able to get around now even that, public response to their own people being murdered, which again isn't like a good response. I mean, it's still self-serving and it's inspired by a love of America, not a care for the victims. But even that's gone now because of the way in which quote unquote war is being conducted in order to limit that possibility of there even being those casualties. So every single American who murdered someone, it was framed as this righteous act of like American exceptionalism, or like it was fighting for freedom and democracy. Whereas everybody that the NLF murdered, it was some senseless and barbaric act of aggression and violence that was just, it may as well just come right from Satan's orders or something. And so the media were able to leave American violence and imperialism unexamined as it showed brutal violence against the Vietnamese. And all this while academics and politicians claimed that the media had an anti-American bias. The same thing we're seeing with Israel, where it's like the BBC and even the New York Times, I think, has been accused by some as having an anti-Israel bias. And it's a very effective strategy because it's able to frame any kind of resistance as being like the most extreme. And if you do that, you frame any kind of resistance as being the most extreme, then it absolutely limits the possibility of actual important oppositional voices and ideas being heard. Now, there was a Freedom House report, which we talked about in the first episode, them and like accuracy in media. There was a Freedom House report that claimed that it was the media's fault the U.S. lost public support for the war, and therefore lost the war, of course, because, without the people's support, the war couldn't continue, because people weren't signing up for the draft, they were resisting it, they were being told about the horrors of the war, and so the media were blamed, even though the media, and this is what drives Chomsky and Herman like totally up the wall, in that they're saying like, the media were still incredibly pro-American if you actually look at how they were depicting the Vietnam War. So to depict, or just for you to illustrate the American depravity after the U.S. bombed a city with 140,000 people, one colonel said, in his words, "We had to destroy the town to save it." Wild, right? Wild. News outlets parroted this idea with Le Monde in France, writing that bombardment was the only way, bombardment was the only way, in their words, to eliminate the NLF's control. Like, liberation through bombing. This was the strategy that they took on. Wild. Now, after the Tet Offensive, the U.S. ramped up bombing campaigns in Laos and Cambodia, killing 100,000 people, more than that, mostly rural peasant civilians. And they also ramped up bombing in the south of Vietnam to increase the number of refugees to limit the NLF's possibilities to recruit in those areas. And this is exactly like what they're doing in Gaza. And what was international law saying? This is fun. In 1973, Vietnamese and the U.S. signed the Paris Peace Accords, and this mandated the end of armed conflict and foreign interference. And what it essentially said was like, the conflict, like in Vietnam, has to be settled between Vietnamese politicians right now. It means an end to armed conflict, and they have to deal with this diplomatically. And the competing Vietnamese parties were to lay down their arms and negotiate. Now, what did the U.S. do? Ignored it. Sort of. They kept troops there and sided with their preferred party in the South, and continued bombing campaigns after 1973, albeit they were doing so a little bit more covertly through their client governments and their mercenary regimes. Now, and this is like typical, like breaking international law, not agreeing to ceasefire agreements, and people wonder why Hamas isn't willing to take a deal with Israel. It's because they know the bombing won't stop. It's like with the Lebanese ceasefire with Hezbollah. Of course, Israel didn't stop bombing after that. Like, it's unbelievable. And Hamas knows that this is who they're dealing with. Like, they know that this is who they're dealing with because Hamas is smart and they're not going to buy any of their lies. And how did the mainstream media justify this? Well, they continually screamed and cried about the horrors of communism, about the violences committed by the northern Vietnamese. But of course, they were conveniently ignoring like how many people in the South were fleeing the Americans to go north and to go into Laos because they didn't know what was going on in Laos. Like, the violence is there. People were fleeing to go north because the U.S. didn't have nearly as much power there because they were being, pushed back. The NLF had a much stronger base there, where the U.S. had very little ability to fight against them. Now, by the quote-unquote war's end in 1975, hundreds of thousands of people had been slaughtered, upwards of 4 million, by the U.S., and many cities had been totally destroyed. There were nearly 1 million orphans, and vast swaths of land were rendered infertile and uninhabitable, so that even though the U.S. quote-unquote lost, it made sure to collectively punish all of Vietnam before withdrawing, to make sure that they would suffer for decades. And they still are. Like, people have genetic issues, are passing on genetic issues because of the use of chemicals in chemical warfare by the U.S. Like, absolutely horrendous. Like, elevated rates of cancer and other disease. Like, absolutely horrible. And to calls for reparations, our boy Jimmy Carter said that the U.S. doesn't owe anyone because the destruction was mutual. In his words, the destruction was mutual. It's wild. Like, how these people, these are absolute scum. Like, worst human beings to have ever existed, and they're celebrated. Like, it's horrible. Now, in all of this, we have to stress that the whole thing about the northern communist aggression was a total lie, which I kind of said earlier. The U.S. was waging war against many people and many different factions in Vietnam. It wasn't just the communists. They were fighting against many other people, and many people were fighting, and other groups were fighting against them in the South. And this was primarily comprised of peasant farmers. These were people just fighting to stay alive and protect their land and family. So, and it's wild. The U.S. dropped 6 times more bombs on, their allies in the South than on northern Vietnam. And they use it's unbelievable. And they would use this fact, this idea. One of the ways that it was justified too was this within the mainstream media was this continued repetition of this idea that the NLF, because they use guerrilla tactics and were recruiting peasants who were not really fighting against the idea of recruiting. They wanted to defend themselves, their lands, their families. The U.S. was using this to be look at how unpredictable they are. This is a sign of their being ultimate evil. Like in the case of Hamas tunnels. Very similar kind of claim. It's really amazing. After a year and a half of decimating Gaza, we've seen so little footage of these fabled Hamas tunnels that apparently run across the whole network. It's really amazing how little evidence we've actually seen of this ultimate terror that is Hamas. But maybe that's just me. It's my opinion. but it's a tactic used against these enemies that are forced to. They're often forced, in the case of insurgency, to adopt guerrilla warfare tactics because they don't have a military on their side. Or as Sinwar said, he was like, if we could use precision bombs to target Israeli like military facilities, we would, but we don't. You know, Hamas had to like duct tape trash cans with fireworks to use for like bombs to try and like put some pressure on Israel. But like that's obviously not going to do anything. They have to adopt these tactics that, because they do not comply with the broader understanding of what a military regime should look like, is then used as evidence of them being like somehow inferior, of being therefore quote unquote primitive, and therefore being less human than these other forces, and therefore being them deserving to die. Now at home, another war was going on, because there was the war against students and other protesters for not being American enough. And this would spawn a lot of the like, you know, the hippie flower power type movement and the reaction to it, the idea that, you know, we needed a return to American values and that the hippies were ruining everything. A lot more to that story, but yeah, there's that war going on there too, very much like we're seeing and have seen with the crackdown on Palestinian protesters, pro-Palestine protesters all across the US. You know, the country that celebrates freedom of speech, that one? Yeah, weird how that works, right? And that puts us into Chapter 6, Indochina Wars II, Laos and Cambodia. Now in 1958, Laos's elections saw communists and or left-leaning governments win the majority of the seats in their government. Left-leaning politicians win the majority of seats in their government, because it was like a parliamentary system, I think, or whatever. They won over half of the available seats. I don't know if they're a parliamentary system, something to look up, whatever. But they won 13 of the 21 available seats were won by communists and or left-leaning political parties and candidates. Now, the communists were largely part of the Pathet Lao guerrillas. And of course, the US couldn't tolerate this. So in the late 50s, they cut off all the aid that they had been supplying to Laos, because Laos had been, you know, having a lot of other issues, and the US was supplying aid, and they're like, oh, you think that you're going to have a free election and the communists will win? So much for all the food we're giving you. And then in 1960, the US backed an extreme right coup, and a civil war ensued, obviously. So the US started to conduct secret operations that would begin in 1960 and 61, and then full-scale bombing coinciding with the Vietnam invasion in 1964. So some estimates suggest that Laos was more heavily bombarded than Vietnam, where they destroyed entire villages, infrastructure, and entire huge swaths of fertile land. Now, mainstream media in the US covered these bombings in one or two stories between 1964 and 1969. Like, that's it. It got like a few stories, and it were like back pages, barely mentioned. And when they fully acknowledged them in 1969, when the mainstream media finally were like, yeah, the US is conducting bombings in Laos, they justified it as an attack on the Ho Chi Minh Trail that the North Vietnamese were ostensibly using to attack the South and to receive supplies from Laos to attack the South. This is the narrative that the mainstream media peddled to justify, to manufacture consent for American imperialism in Southeast Asia. Now, obviously, the U.S. intended to render the country uninhabitable, like it would end up doing with Vietnam. It was essentially trying to make the possibility of communism impossible, which is another good strategy here, is that you can render any economic system impossible and make a country totally dependent on its aggressor and its neighbors a lot of the time, and make it impossible for them to actually have some amount of independence and exercise independent economic and political authority, which is absolutely horrible. And so the mainstream media would then blame the North Vietnamese communists for their aggression in Laos without ever mentioning that the communists had won the election. And the communists weren't some foreign threat in Laos. They had won the election fairly, democratically, and it was the U.S. then arranging a coup, throwing the country into civil war, and bombing it indiscriminately that was the problem. But of course, the mainstream media was not going to mention any of this. And then there's the case of Cambodia that endured what is now recognized as a decade of genocide in the 1970s, where between 1969 and 1973, the U.S. bombed it just to oblivion. Like it was so violent and horrendous. And then in 1973, it would kind of stop bombing Cambodia and instead diverted its attention to supporting the Khmer Rouge. Now, the Khmer Rouge is kind of some important backstory here. The Khmer Rouge was not exactly on the highest, held in the highest regard by the United States because, believe it or not, the U.S., as usual when it comes to enemies, didn't like how violent the Khmer Rouge were. But the U.S. still backed them because they thought that the Khmer Rouge, which were a socialist, really communist group, were a better alternative that could be more easily controlled than the Vietnamese communists. So between 1973 and 1975, when the U.S. wasn't really totally bombing Cambodia, it supported the Khmer Rouge and its death squads and violences it was inflicting there, until the Khmer Rouge fully took power in 1975. Now, from 1975 to 1978, the U.S. continued to back the murderous Khmer Rouge until the Vietnamese overthrew it in 1978. So the Vietnamese were like steadfast. They kicked out the Americans, which was an absolute triumph. And then they're like, we're not done yet. We have to help Cambodia. And then they got their troops and went into Cambodia and liberated them from the Khmer Rouge, which would be something you think the U.S. would have supported because outwardly the U.S. was like, Jimmy Carter's out there being like, oh yeah, the Khmer Rouge is pretty bad. Yeah, pretty bad. But they're better than the, Vietnamese communists. And then when the Vietnamese communists overthrow the Khmer Rouge, then it's just used as extra evidence of how bad the Vietnamese are. But the Khmer Rouge did not go away. So the Khmer Rouge was led by Pol Pot. Well, we're getting a little bit more of this, but after the after the communist Vietnamese overthrew the Khmer Rouge in 1978, the Khmer Rouge continued to terrorize with the U.S. backing for years. Continued to terrorize Cambodians for years, trying to murder politicians, conducting terrorist operations at the behest of the Americans. But it wasn't just the Americans. That would be totally wrong history if I were to make you think that. The Americans were interested, definitely, but there was also China. They were backed by other groups. They were backed by North Korea. And there's so many others that were interested in the Khmer Rouge for various different ideological reasons. But, they were definitely against the interests of the Cambodian people. Now, again, of course, we could document all of the horrors of the Vietnamese in Cambodia. No denying that. I'm not going to pretend as though that didn't happen. But again, it's an issue of United States' violence going unrecognized at all, and everyone else's violence being amplified to 11 just to try and justify continued American imperialism that is so much worse than all of these other kinds of violence, all of these other state actors. Now, it's interesting the way that the U.S. started to kind of care about Cambodians between 1975 and 1978, because that's when the Vietnamese started to show up. Then they were suddenly really worried about Cambodians. No mention of the fact that the decade before they had been bombing them indiscriminately. They didn't care about them then. But they really started to care when the specter of communism began to seep in there. Then they were really worried about the Cambodians. And this wasn't inspired by care for Cambodians, but simply to put all the blame on the North Vietnamese, and when it was convenient for them, onto the Khmer Rouge, and be like, oh, it's not us. We aren't, it's not the fact that we backed them to fight against the communists in Vietnam. No. That's not the problem. They're the problem. They are just really messed up, and that's all we can do with it. And this was largely in Chomsky and Herman's words, to permit a retrospective justification for the earlier French and American crimes, and to provide the illusion of U.S. care for justice, which, it worked really well. And then the US was able to say and present this idea that they are super righteous, they care about freedom and safety and all this nonsense. But of course, it was all nonsense. All nonsense. Because what often goes unrecognized here is really that the history of French colonialism in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos in the early to mid 20th century, where these countries were were under colonial rule, which largely inspired a lot of these resistance groups and insurgent groups to fight against them and to actually develop like military strategies to fight against their oppressors. Hence why the Vietnamese were so prepared to deal with the Americans when they showed up. Now, there were different international circumstances that led to different American strategies, where guerrilla groups in Laos were recognized under the Geneva Conventions, but guerrilla groups in Cambodia were not. Hence why the US could have so much more control and sway over the Khmer Rouge, and why it was and Pol Pot, why it was a lot more, effective for them to have that influence there against the Vietnamese. Because if they didn't, their fear was that the Vietnamese would just take over. And obviously they couldn't have that. Now in 1969, Prince Sihanouk pleaded to the international press to cover the US's indiscriminate bombings of peasants. Like, these are people, they were just civilians that had nothing to do with anything. They were just being bombed indiscriminately. And Prince Sihanouk was like screaming to the international press, like, just look at this for like 5 minutes. Just like any amount of attention, like, please. And of course they didn't. They didn't look at Cambodia. They only looked at Cambodia when the blame could be attributed to insurgents, when it could be conveniently placed against the Khmer Rouge. Of course, no mention of the U.S. backing of them. Or when it can be blamed against the Vietnamese. Because then, suddenly, the mainstream media was very concerned about those poor rural peasants. Now again, like, I just have to emphasize, like, the Khmer Rouge is horrible. Like, there's a whole film about this. Interesting, the film, The Killing Fields. It's amazing how, like, these films work within the propaganda model as well. Because the films only depict the horrors of the Khmer Rouge and totally decontextualize U.S. Funding and backing of the Khmer Rouge. And the way in which they had, like, there's one, I think just a few scenes in the film that recognize, like, a single moment of U.S. bombing of Cambodia. Totally just takes that out of the picture. And just rightly amplifies, as it should be, because it was horrible, the violences of the Khmer Rouge. But some people were estimating that the Khmer Rouge had murdered like upwards of 2 million people. Like, absolutely horrendous, like, absolutely horrible. But that, likelier it was in the thousands, which is still horrendous and still deserves all the media coverage that we can give it, as it should deserve for that many deaths. But it's like, this is part of the atrocity propaganda cycle to justify these American violence and continued American imperialism. Now, one of the other interesting kind of haunting things I should say about this period in Cambodia between 1975 and 1978, when the Khmer Rouge took power eventually before they were overthrown, is that the Americans were actually, and the American State Department wasn't really hiding any of these facts. It was just that media weren't covering them, because media, like, kind of autonomously are just parroting their own ideological frameworks. Because to them, I mean, these are individual writers and editors. Of course, they're just going to reflect that worldview that they're immersed in. Hence the importance of, like, actually learning about things like ideology and those things that go unrecognized in our day-to-day lives. Like, one of the things I like to tell my students is, like, is it a coincidence that many of us in this room have our father's last name? Like, is this just a neutral way to organize society, or does this reflect patriarchal power that many of us have never thought of? And I get this example from Louis Althusser. Like, is this just a neutral thing that has no bearing on our world or gender relations or anything? Like, of course it does, but it goes unrecognized. And that's exactly what these newspapers were beholden to, these kinds of forces, these ideological forces that go unseen, unrecognized. And yeah, that puts us into the conclusion, where they repeat a lot of the stuff that they covered, and they emphasize that the media are beholden to propaganda, to the propaganda model. Even at times, they are the most so-called, like they're the most independent. So people will point to things like Watergate and be like, look, see, the media can actually work against their own government. And it's like, okay, fine. You can cite this as an example, but this is hardly going against the fabric of American imperialism. Like, it's not doing that at all. And it's also super interesting to see that the U.S. press with like Bernstein and the other Woodward were like, maybe the Washington Post, whoever they're working for. I should know that. Kind of delegitimizes me a little bit. But Chomsky and Herman make the point. They're like, how come we weren't seeing all this press coverage when the FBI was raiding socialist organizations or other union groups or the Black Panthers? Like, how come we didn't see that same kind of gumption on the part of journalists to like uncover the truth of what was going on? How come we don't find out about that conspiracy of the FBI against the Black Panthers or the union people or anything like that? And he's like, or they're like, yeah, you can cite this as an example of American, a free press, an independent press, but it's still working within the limits of like the ideological frameworks here. It's not outside of it. And their plea at the end is that we need independent media. That is extremely important. Like, we need independent media that is actually going to call out the violence when they see it, to call out American imperialism, to call out empire, to call out Israel. And there are good things being done on like TikTok and Instagram, especially in the way that people are actually able to depict and illustrate exactly what they're experiencing. But there's a whole slew of other problems that are presented with these, with tech capitalism, with platform capitalism, I should say, with these social media platforms and tech sites and all of that, where they are going to be beholden to their own filters and express and maintain, and even in a more effective way, I think, actually limit what people can see and carefully regulate what they actually consume, what information they're actually able to consume, and what information people are allowed to get out there. And it's going to be so much harder to recognize it, because whereas before, in the case of news media, like we talked about in the last few episodes, it's able to present the illusion that it's like a free press, it's fighting the power. The internet, because there's so much information being presented on it, is able to provide the illusion that there's this endless sea of stuff you can pull from. You can pull from. This pool of stuff you can pull from. And it gives you that illusion that everything is just made available. And it's just up to users to then get the information that they need, when that's not the case at all, because there's so much of it that's just being filtered out from even being possibly seen and recognized. And and not to mention the fact that even if people did see it, they still need to have like the ideological awareness to see when they're seeing propaganda or stuff that's just satisfying American propaganda interests. But yeah, that's what this book is for. But yeah, if there's anything I got wrong, anything I excluded, I'd love to hear about it. I hope that it was illuminating for you. I mean, it's a fantastic book. It will go down in history as one of the greats. Well, it already is, but like for enduring history, if history does endure. And yeah, if you like what I did, you can like, share, subscribe, consider donating to one of the organizations below. And I'll catch you next time. Probably going to start Cedric Robinson, Black Marxism. I think that's the next book I'm doing. And yeah, cool. See you later, y'all.